welcome to Empower 2021. We are so excited to have you all here to experience our session that we are entitling Forms Level Up. I didn't know you can do that. Friendly reminder that this session is being recorded. So if there's anything that you may miss during the session, you could always come back and watch our on-demand session. I am one of your hosts today. My name is Pinheiro. I'm an implementation consultant. I've been with Quickbase just over a year, but prior to joining Quickbase, I spent the better part of 2 decades as a software implementation consultant in the fintech space. I'll now turn it over to Bob so he can introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Sturgeon. I'm an implementation consultant at Quickbase also. I've been here about 2 years, but prior to that, I was a customer of Quickbase for 20 years. So I've implemented lots of different use cases, situations, and I absolutely love it. That's why we're here. Also want to introduce our Q&A folks who are going to be answering your questions in the Q&A section. We've got Kate and Marissa and Neil and Rami and Sharon Faust, who is has Quickbase Junkie. And we've learned a lot of the things, the HTML that we're going to go through Quickbase Junkie. So thank you, Sharon, for helping us out.
Okay, so what is this session about? Are you unsure of what a form is, how it can be used? Are you looking for ways to optimize your current forms? Are you wanting to build a form along with a Quickbase expert like Bob and myself? Are you an experienced builder but want to take your forms to a new level? If you've answered yes to any of those questions, well, you're in the right place. So let's level up. So the key takeaways of this session: you're going to learn about the native features used to customize a form. You're going to understand how to organize data on a form, uncover those hidden properties that make a huge difference, develop skills to create a workflow using forms and API buttons. We'll talk different forms of API buttons that you have available to you. And then we're going to level up your data by using rich text. So imagine going from something like this to maybe something like this, or perhaps even something like this. This is what we're going to talk about during this session. If you want more and you want to truly level up your data, we're going to provide you with an application that you can download after this session with plenty of examples that you can use to incorporate into the applications that you currently have, or perhaps the applications that you plan to build. Any questions that you may have during the session, like Bob had mentioned before, we have a wonderful panel of folks here to answer those questions for you in chat. If there's anything that you'd like to perhaps save towards the end, we will be having a live Q&A. Okay, Bob, I'll turn it over to you for the first section.
All right, so the agenda for the first section is what makes up a form. We're going to go through form elements, form properties, dynamic form rules, and as always, put your questions in the Q&A. We'll do a live Q&A at the end of the session. All right, so what makes up a form? Elements, properties, dynamic form rules. First of all, what is a form? It's a user-friendly way to display information, right? If you're looking at a spreadsheet, we have an Excel spreadsheet here. Each line on the spreadsheet is a record, and to see all the data, a lot of times you'd have to keep scrolling to the right, and it's not user-friendly and easy to use. So we take that data and we distill it down to a form. And you can add new projects, tasks, you can add any type of record, edit records, view records, etc., and they are fully customizable. So why are they important? Obviously, the number one reason, better adoption. We spend all our time building these apps. We want people to use them, right? So they've got to be user-friendly, have a good workflow, intuitive, and so forth. So user-friendly, easier to find the information. It's in the right place where we want to see it. And we can also control who sees that information. On a record, not everybody needs to see confidential information or things like that. You want to focus on what their role is. So we can filter those things through. All right, so viewing forms on a table. To get to the forms, whatever table you're on, in the example number 1, we're on the accounts table, and you go to the settings icon there. And then over to number 2, that'll take you to the table settings page. And in the middle at the bottom, you'll see the forms. And you see there we've got 2 forms that we've created. And you look down below in 3, it'll show us a list of the forms. We have project's main form and untitled, things that we're working on. And you over on the right, you'll see what Manny's going to go through a little more detail later. Each form also has a unique form ID. And then down below, you'll also notice you can designate different forms for each role, for each purpose. If you want to get to that level of detail, that's possible. All right, so the layout options, on the left, what we see is an actual form in use for cases. And on the right, what you see is our customized form screen. And there's the three elements we're going to talk about, or the three sections on the form we're going to talk about are elements, properties, and dynamic form rules. All right, so what makes up a form? Form elements. Okay, so when you create a table and add your fields, Quickbase will add those to the form automatically for you. And you see here we've got a list of all of our fields from line 3 down below. Up above that, we've got some other sections. So fields, we've got, you can put any field on a form, any field that you created. Those can be static text fields, date fields, etc. It can also be formulas. You can create buttons. Manny will show you that later. Do formula calculations and so forth. And you can also do report links. You can embed reports on your form. And then we've got our formatting section up the top. We've got text, section, heading, and tab. We can add text with HTML or just plain text. Sometimes we use those for navigational or directions, instructions on what to do next, how to use the form. We've also got section headings where you can group information together. And then a new feature within the last few years at Quickbase, we've got tabs that will make your form look better and not have to scroll all the way down. And then we've also got the display properties over on the right. And you notice this is for section heading. We can name the heading, we can collapse it. The big one we're going to use is field labels, whether they appear above the fields or to the left of the fields. And then down at the bottom, you can say, I only want this field to show when I'm editing or adding or viewing or any combination thereof. Okay, so with form elements, you can add multiple child reports on a form, including graphs and charts. You can see other records from the same table by doing a report link. And some advanced examples we're going to go through today, add buttons to direct to other forms on the same record. We're also going to show you some HTML elements to really make that form pop and create customized status banners, so many different things you can do. All right, let's level up. I'm going to share my screen. And let's go in and actually take a look at how these forms work. There we go. Can y'all see my screen? See it okay, yep. Manny? Yep. Okay, thanks. Okay, great. So we've got one record here. Forgive that picture. But one record, I'm the user, and I'm going to go in and edit my form. So again, when Quickbase creates the form for you, it just goes down the line. This is all linear. It lists out all the fields that we've created. And let's dress this up a little bit. This is maybe kind of tough for our users to work through. So I'm going to do some things like, let's group name and phone number and email. Let's put this into a logical workflow. So one way to do that is go over here to the upper right and customize this form. All right, and there's the elements that we just looked at. So you notice the first line is picture, nickname, all those things. Well, I'm going to group all my names together. So down here I've got middle, last, suffix, preferred. And what I can do is, you see I clicked on line 10. I'm going to click on line 14, highlight all of them, and then click up a few times. There, now I've got all my names together. Okay, let's go out and take a look real quick. All right, so I've got all my names grouped together, but I want to put them in a better order. That just doesn't flow right? So I could go back out to customize this form, but I'm going to do a shortcut, and I can right-click on the element that I want to start with. So I want to start arranging the names here. So I'm going to right-click nickname, and I go to the fourth option here, edit the properties of this form element. And you notice it takes me directly to that line. So if you've got hundreds of fields on your form, which is not unusual, it'll take you right down to the element you're looking for. So let's move some things around. I want first, middle, last, so I'm going to highlight those, move those up, and suffix maybe behind the last name. All right, and then preferred first name, just move things around a little bit, right? Go out and take a look, and you can see that now I've got these all in order. This is still kind of tough to scroll through, so I'm going to do a couple things here. I want to put first, middle, last name, and suffix all on the same line. So again, I right-click, go to Properties. Now you see this same row, this list of checkboxes. If this checkbox is blank, that will start the row. So the first name we want in the first position, then everything else to follow it. So middle, last, and suffix. And then the next line, I want to start a new one, preferred nickname or preferred first name, and then nickname, and then prior last name. I want those to follow. So let's take a look at that. That's a little bit better. It's all on the same line, but it still pushes everything out to the right. And in fact, if I go to edit mode, it pushes things way out there. So let's clean that up a little bit. And we can do that by adding a section. I want to add a section above this so that my field labels are above the field. So I right-click where I want to go to the Properties. And above first name, I'm going to click Insert, make a new selection. I could select another field, but in here I want to put a section heading. All right, and let's call this name. And I want to put the field labels above. Let's see what that looks like. Much better, especially when I go into edit mode, right? There you go. It pulls everything back over to the left. Much easier. Now we can go back in and move around the phone numbers and all that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing this, but let's take a look at it. And you notice when I put in a section, now everything that follows that section, now all my field labels are above the fields. So let's go in and right-click, edit the properties, and let's put our phone numbers on the same line, email address, all those things on the same line. I'm going to put in another section for phone and email. And again, I'm going to put those labels above. Now, if I put in another section, if I go down to my demographic data and I put in another section for demographic, and I'm going to leave the field labels in their default position to the left. The sections control, these indicators control everything until you hit a new section or a tab, as I'll show you. So there we go. So I've got three sections now, name, phone, and email, and demographics. And these two, the labels are above, and these, the labels are to the left. Sometimes you'll have a list of things where you want the labels on the left, so you can intersperse them. And in fact, I could even put in another, I'm going to put in another section heading here with no name on it. And I just want that for alignment purposes, maybe. So I'll go back and add another section heading with no name. And I'll just leave that as it is. All right, so you see how it aligns it a little differently. That's basically it. I'm not going to go ahead and do this. Manny's got another template set up where this stuff's arranged, but we'll take a look at that. Let's see, sections, tabs, and that's it. Let's go to good here. Okay, so questions, put your questions. I see you've got some good questions going in the Q&A, and we'll answer live at the end also. The next two things that we're going to do on the form are take a look at form properties and dynamic form rules. All right, so form properties control the form's appearance and behavior. So you notice you can include a name. We've got checkboxes that control different features on the form. When there's embedded reports, we usually leave this as the standard default for performance reasons. And then when you create new fields, what do you want it to do with those fields? Automatically add them or not? And then dynamic form rules, these are really cool. These are like the real power of forms. So it allows you to create different behaviors based on specifications. Like we said earlier, you can create different forms for different roles, but you can have users within the same role on the form, and depending on things, how they use the form, you can have different options appear. Like you can dynamically fill in fields. Data validation. You can't put in a date before today if it's a start, right? Things like that. We can do conditional fields, sections, and tabs. I'm going to show you a really neat feature on that. So we'll show you the admin section in a form. That's part of this conditional sections and tabs. And then multiple choice other fields and how to hide a tab or section based on a role. All right, so a couple things about dynamic form rules. They only apply to that form. In this exercise, we're going to create multiple forms, and when you've got a dynamic form rule, it only applies to that form that you're on. It also doesn't work in Grid Edit, because in Grid Edit, you're in a report, you're not on a form. So you need to do custom table rules for that. Dynamic form rules also do not work in mobile offline, and your form rules can conflict, but fortunately, Quickbase will give you an error message or to let you know. It's not an error, you can still save it, but it'll let you know you've got conflicting rules. All right, so with that, let's go back to our demonstration. See my screen okay? There it is. All right, so let's go take a look at our properties. For that, I'm going to go back up to customize this form. Let's take a look at the properties, and we've got a name. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that name for this demonstration, but I could change this to special view for whatever part of the workflow. Another thing that a lot of developers like to do is add the date that was last modified. Sometimes when you've got a lot of forms, you can see which one's the most recent. Okay, so then we've got all the checkboxes. Show horizontal rules between sections. That's by default turned on. We had it off here, but I'm going to turn that on and show you what happens. Remember, I created all these sections. Now it's got blue lines, which is kind of okay if I've got a contiguous section that shows like data. But then down here, where I just created a section for formatting, I've still got a blue line. So I like to turn those off by default. By my default, that is. So I turn that off, and now we can see those are gone, and the form looks a little cleaner. All right, so let's go look at some other field properties. Show built-in fields and save and close at the end. I'm going to do both of those at one time. Okay, built-in fields and show save and close buttons at the end of the form. I'm going to turn those on. And you notice when we're editing, we've always got save and close up here at the top. But if we've checked that box on our properties, we've also got save and close here at the bottom. Sometimes we want to turn that off because, as Manny's going to show you, we'll create custom buttons that we want to put at the end of the form. So we can turn that off so it doesn't confuse our users. And then lastly, the built-in fields. Show built-in fields. I check that box so it shows when it was created, by who last updated it, etc. Sometimes you don't want your users to see that. Sometimes you do, so you can control that. All right. Allow field labels to wrap. That just means if you've got some really long field labels, that it will create 2 or 3 lines out of it and not push everything to the right. Show save and keep working. I really like this one for, especially when I'm in development mode, because a lot of times we're just testing things, and if my options are only save and close, and I change something, I want to see the effect, I save it, and then I have to edit it again. But in this case, I can do save and keep working, and it brings me right back into edit mode. Okay, so that's usually the way I like things to be set up. When they're embedded reports, I rarely touch this one. I usually go with the default behavior for performance purposes, where the form will load first and then the embedded report will load afterwards. And then once I've got most of my fields in place, I don't want it to add fields automatically, because it's just going to place them at the end of the report. And as I'm developing, I want to put those where they go. So I usually change this to do nothing. You could say ask whether the fields should be added. Again, it'll add them to the bottom to the form. All right. So one thing I always do, every single form I create, me as a developer, I like to put in an admin section at the top that other users can't see. I'm going to go ahead and save and close this. So I'm going to insert an admin section up here. So let's go to customize this form. And at the very top, I'm going to go down here to insert, and I'm going to insert a few rows. And my very first one is going to be a section, and I'm going to name that admin. And I'm going to put field labels above that section. Now remember, admin is going to be fields that only I can see. Maybe there's some things like number of approved days. There's like summary fields, and we'll have some other helper and formula fields and things that only we as developers need to see. Now remember, your section is valid until it hits another section or another tab. So I do need to put another section in front of the picture, or else that will be included in the admin section. So I insert a row, click a section heading, and I'll just leave that blank. I don't need a header over the picture, right? And I don't care about the field labels because the picture, we don't need a field label to tell us it's a picture. I can use alternate field label and leave it blank. That's another neat thing over here. So let's go take a look, see what that looks like. All right, so now I've got an admin section, and I can collapse that, but I don't want my end users to see that admin section, right? So I'm going to create a custom form rule, or dynamic form rule. So I go into Customize, and dynamic form rules. We've got a couple that I'm going to go through, but I need to add a new one for my admin section. All right, so I add a new rule. It comes to the bottom, and I can use these. I'm going to go ahead and move that to the top. For some reason, I always like my admin section at the top. So let's say I have conditions. When something happens, do something. So when the user is in the role administrator, then we're going to show the admin section. You see down below, automatically, when the user is not in the admin role, hide the admin section. Let's go take a look. It's still there. That's because I'm an admin. If I go and change my role to or test my role, test as a different role, and I test as participant, the admin section's hidden. So if you have it only available to your admins, your users will never see that section. Pretty cool trick. And the admin, when you're developing, troubleshooting, anything you're doing, it's really great to have this section with all these different hidden fields so you can see what's going on. Something else I want to show that's really cool in the dynamic form rules. Location. Let's go back real quick, sorry. So we've got a work section here, and I'm remote. I'm in Palo Alto, so let's go into edit mode and take a look at the different options here. Okay, so I'm remote. I'm in Palo Alto, and when I filled this out, it filled out the address and thus the map for me. But let's say I was in our Boston office. You see, I've got remote city, remote state. When I go to Boston office, those fields disappear, and now this field's in automatically. If I change that to Salt Lake City, this changes automatically. That's dynamic form rules. If I go back to remote, all right, now where am I? There you go. And you see, as I type that in, it fills out down here. Is that cool or what? Let's see how that works. What I've done is set up a few different dynamic form rules. And the first one that I like to show, if the location is equal to Boston, this is remember our location is a multiple choice, Boston, Salt Lake City, or remote. If it's in Boston, I want to change the office, city, and state to Boston, Massachusetts, and I want to remove remote city and state. If we didn't do this, those values would still be there if they had existed previously. Okay, same thing goes for Salt Lake City. And the neat thing is, if we added another office, say in Atlanta, I could copy this rule and just change this. So I'm not going to do that, just wanted to show it. I can disable that rule, which is very helpful while you're troubleshooting, or you can delete that rule. But the other really cool dynamic form rule we did said, when location is equal to remote, then we're going to show the field remote city. And then we're going to show remote state, and we're going to require both of those fields. And when those are entered, we're going to change the city and state to the value in the field remote city and remote state. That's simple. You can fill it in with static values, formulaic values, or you can pull values from other fields to do that. And one last thing. You notice, let's see, let's go to a different, I'll just pick a random one here. Pick a random table. I'm going to pick a random record. And you see my record descriptor up here. It's my table and the record ID. And it's that way for all the tables as a default. But in resources, you notice mine was, well, I could even pull up Manny's. It's got his name there. How do we do that? Well, you go out, do the table settings for the table you're on, and it's in the advanced settings, and down there with the record title. You can, by default, it's the key field, but we've chosen to display the name. One really neat thing here you can do is this, you can pull any field from the table. Full name probably makes the most sense here. You could also make a formula field that concatenates together different values. I could have full name, active employee, and start date, for instance, something like that. A lot of different things you can do. So be sure and save it when you're done. Back to the table, and resources now shows the full name because that's what we designated. And that is it for elements, properties, and dynamic form rules. If you've got any questions, please keep putting them in the chat. I see we've got a lot going. And again, we'll do live Q&A at the end of the session. Back to you, Manny.
All right, let's level up, guys. So agenda 2, we are going to be talking about creating a workflow. And in doing so, we're going to be talking about using multiple forms to support that workflow along with the API buttons that I mentioned before. And as we've been talking about along the way, we will have a portion at the end of this session for live Q&A. Okay, so let's talk about using multiple forms. So this is a traditional view, very similar to what Bob has already presented to you, right? Very flat. This can become very cumbersome when we have tables with a lot of data, right? We also saw examples of this where you can jazz things up and add a picture by using a file attachment field, right? But let's imagine something more like this, where we have targeted data, right? Consider this a main view, and you'll notice that at the bottom of the slide, you'll see some buttons that we'll talk about in just a moment, right? But this is essentially the same data that Bob has been presenting all along. So let's break down the elements when we talk about multiple forms, right? So we want to create some depth to the data that we have in our application, right? So here on the left-hand side, we're representing the multiple forms that we could potentially have, right? And each of these forms would present a different experience showing different data based on what the user is interested in seeing. On the right-hand side, you saw some of this when Bob was going through his presentation. This is the settings for forms. And you can see that these are all of the forms that we have available to us. And we can identify them not only by name, but you can also see all the way to the right, we have form IDs, right? So for example, if we look at the bottom here, number 27 correlates to this time off history that we have right at the bottom. And the list goes on. So we'll talk about the power of form IDs and how we'll be using them a little bit later on for navigation. So here's a more in-depth view of the forms that we'll be working with today. So here we have 4 separate forms. We have our main view, we have a demographics view, we have a work view, and we also have a time off history view. And then we see those form IDs that we spoke about just a moment ago, right? And then here, towards the right, you see a different experience that we're presenting on all of the forms that we have available to us. Again, if you look at that top left-hand square, that's our main view. And then we have our API buttons that can then take us, for example, to demographics, which is just to the right. And then below, we have 2 different experiences, one for work information, and then another one for time off history. So let's go ahead and level up, and let's get into the application, and let's talk a little bit more about this. Okay, you all should be able to see my screen. Bob, if you just let me know once you can see it.
Yep, I see it. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. So here is a little bit more of a different view. It's a little bit more organized. Bob showed you how to organize your data in sections. And what we've done here is we've taken a step further where we've created tabs to house all of our information. But again, this is still, in my opinion, a little flat. However, we can make this so much better by adding the additional forms, again, to direct users to the information that they're most interested in. So again, remember, let's say you have an application today, or perhaps you're planning an application where you know a table will have lots of data. What you're about to see will help you organize that data in a much better way. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my settings. I'm going to access my forms. Then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy this form down here. This is the form that I was just looking at. It's the template that Bob was using. So I'll copy my form. And the first thing that I'm going to do when I get into the customize section of the form is go into properties and label my form. So what I'll do is I will call this my demo main view. And one of the things that we like to do is we actually like to date our forms. So that way we know this is the last time that a change was made, or perhaps this was the day that the form was actually added. Okay, so what do we have here? So we have all of the fields, sections, and tabs that we just saw a moment ago when you saw the actual form. And what we want to do is we want to do a little bit more organizing, but we also want to streamline a lot of the data that we have here. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to take my username. I'm going to put this up here, and I'm going to put it just below my picture. Next, I'm going to go and look for my role and my hire date and years of service. So I'm going to group these together, and using the trick that Bob showed us to highlight all of the rows, I'm going to do that and then use my button to move these up. And then move it right next to the picture as well. Okay, so just take my role, I'm going to put this down here and put it under my username. I'm going to keep this checked so the role is right next to the username. And I'm also going to check the user service so that gets displayed next to the hire date. Okay, so that is the little bit of organization that I'm going to do. And now I'm actually going to remove all of the data that we have remaining. So I've highlighted all the rows that I intend to remove. And I'm going to click on the button. And you can see that all of those rows are gone. Now, that was a very drastic change. But you can see that Quickbase gives us the ability to preview the change rather than save. So I'll go ahead and preview to make sure that I like the changes that I've made. So you can see that Quickbase gives us the ability to see this particular form in edit mode, but we can also see it in view mode. So this is the result. Okay, this is great. It's very targeted. We see the information that we want to see, but we've created an issue. We now have no way to navigate away from this particular form, right? So that's what we'll talk about next. We'll talk about how we can actually create some formula URL buttons to go ahead and navigate to the different forms that we have available to us. So I will go ahead and save this form. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here and I'm going to change the experience for my particular role. And right now I'm the formula URL administrator. I'm going to make this my main view. And I'll make it my main view for everything at the moment. Actually, I'm going to leave the template for Bob here. And now what we'll do is we'll actually start talking about some of the other forms that we have available. So what we've done is we have essentially recreated this main view. And now we have all of these other forms that are available to us, right? And you can see that here are our form IDs, right? So let's go ahead and start talking about those API buttons. Okay, and if there are any questions that you may have about what you just saw regarding multiple forms, or perhaps any questions you may have from Bob's section, please go ahead and put those questions into the chat now. Otherwise, you can save them for the live Q&A at the end. API buttons for navigation. So let's break down the elements for our API buttons. So here we have three different examples, right? We have one for the demographics, we have one for work, and we have one for time off, right? And you see that there are many similarities in the formulas that we have, but if you graze over to the right with your eyes, you'll notice that we have very specific form IDs that are defined. 25 for demographics, 26 for work, 27 for time off, right? Again, based on those forms that we have available to us that we've demonstrated before, right? So let's talk a little bit more about what these formulas are doing and what they actually mean, those elements. What are they actually doing within this formula? So the first thing that we have is the URL root. What the URL root is doing is it's returning the first part of the URL that is used to access Quickbase, including the protocol and the site name. So if we look over here, the current realm that I'm in is our demo realm. So that is what the URL is returning, URL root specifically, demo.quickbase.com. If I look at the next section, DB and the DB ID, in this particular case, DB ID is returning a text value containing the database ID of the table. In this particular case, the table that the user is on. So this is what Quickbase is building when you pass that long in the chain. The next thing that we have here is the action. In this particular case, we're displaying a record, and we're displaying a record based on the record ID that is passed in the record ID field. And then last, and in this case, in my opinion, most importantly, we have this function called DFID. And what the DFID function allows us to do is to pass that form ID related to the form that we're intending to target the user. So again, the DFID allows for displaying data using a specific form ID. So here's the example of that. And then in the end, if you were looking at your browser in the actual address bar, this is what you would see. Okay? Now, here's another very specific example that we will see in the application in just a moment. This is a button where we can actually request PTO. But in this case, you'll notice that I'm not passing that DB ID like we had here. What I'm actually doing is I'm passing a very specific table ID, right? So here we want to direct the user away from the resources table where they actually click the button, and we want to take them over to the vacation schedules table, right? So whenever you see something explicitly defined such as this, what we're doing is we're actually taking the user away or directing the user away from the current table. Okay, and we'll see an example of this in just a moment. So let's go ahead and level up, and let's get back into the application, and let's create one of these formula URL buttons. And Bob, once again, if you could help me out and let me know once you can see the screen.
Got it, thanks.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so we'll use one of the tricks that we saw before. We're gonna go ahead and right-click on the role field. I'm going to go ahead and add a field after this one. And all the way down at the bottom of this list, we have the ability to create a new field. So what I'll do is I will call this my demographics button. And I'm going to go ahead and select the type of formula URL. Okay. And now here we have our button. It's clearly not attractive, certainly not in the spot that we want it to be. So again, I'll use some of the tricks that Bob showed us before. I'm now right on my demographic button. I have the ability to move this down just below the section, right? And then the other thing that I'm going to do while I'm here is I'm going to go ahead and click on Use Alternate Label. And here I can actually relabel the field to be something perhaps a little bit more intuitive or specific to the user that will be using this application. But in this case, I'm going to leave it blank, and I'll explain why in just a moment. So here we have our field, has nothing going on. But what I'll do now is, rather than clicking on the properties for the form element, I'm going to click on Edit the Field Properties for this field. Now this is where we'll actually be able to put everything together for this button to make everything work. Before I actually apply the formula, the first thing that I like to do is actually apply a label. So in this case, we want it to be our demographics button. I'm also going to go ahead and check off Display as a button on the form. And you'll notice what Quickbase has done here. It's given us the ability to actually choose a color for the button. So this is really fun and something that you could actually work with the folks that are responsible for branding within your organization. And perhaps you folks have a very specific color that you'd like to use. And in that case, maybe you could get lucky and they can provide you with a hex value for that color. Otherwise, you can use what Quickbase provides you in this palette to actually just slide around and choose a color. In this case, I have a very specific hex value that I want to apply. And it's going to give us this nice light teal color. So that's what the color of the button will be, and that's how it will display on the screen when we see it in just a moment. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start to build in my formula. So we will go ahead and begin with the URL root. And then I'm going to go ahead and chain it along with the ampersand sign. And the next thing, like we saw in our example in the presentation, we're going to go ahead and apply the DB ID. We will chain that along again with the action that we'd like to perform. In this case, we want to display the record and the record ID based on the record ID value in this field, the record ID number. And then lastly, we will chain it along with DFID, and we will specify the specific form ID for, in this case, the demographics form, right? So this is our formula. All right, so I've gone ahead and I've saved this form. I'm not going to necessarily press on it now. What I'm going to do is, in preparation for this, we went ahead and we created some additional buttons to get us to the other forms that we prepared for, and I showed you in the first section that I presented. So the next button that I'll select is my work form button. And then lastly, I will select my time off history button. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put them side by side and save. All right, great. We have our buttons, but it's not really what we want them to look like. Again, this is a little bit redundant. We understand that this is going to take us to our work form. We understand that this is going to take us to the time off form. So again, using some of the trickery that Bob showed us before, we will go ahead and click on use alternate label and leave it blank. And same thing for time off history. And there we have it, right? So we're starting to see an end result, right? We're starting to understand that depth that I referred to before. So now, when I click on the demographics button, you'll see that it takes me to a completely different experience versus what we saw on the main form, right? I can see that I have my name, my phone, my demographic information. I can click through all those tabs. Again, very specific to that demographic information or that demographic button that I clicked on. I can actually return to main. This will take me back to that main screen. But if I went back to demographics, you'll notice that I have the ability to put those buttons here as well. So if I want to go right to my work page from demographics, I can click here. And you can see here that we just have our work information. So work, active status, hire date, role, etc. And we also have the work location. Once again, I can return back to main. And then here we can go off to time off history. One thing that I just want to draw your attention to, I don't know if anybody's noticed, is that as I was clicking on these buttons, you'll notice that we were staying all within the resources table. And I'll show you that again. If I go back to resources, demographics, you'll notice that we're still on resources. Time off, we're still on resources, right? Now, if I click here, you'll notice that we've been taken to vacation requests. Again, illustrating that second button, that request PTO button, where we did not have a DB ID defined, where it was specifically the DB ID for the table that we wanted to target the users for. Okay. I will go back to my resources. Let me look at my record once again. And a couple of things I want to highlight while we're here. So here we have a custom edit button. It was very different from the native button that we have available here. The native button will actually take you to the form that's defined for the particular role. That's what Bob showed you under form settings. In this particular case, this edit button, if I look at the formula, it's very similar to what you saw before, right? With the URL root, the DB ID. The difference that we have here is the action that we're performing. So before, we were doing a DR for display record. In this particular case, we're doing an ER for edit record, but we are passing the value for, in this case, the work form, right? So if I go back to that form, I'm sorry, actually, I'm on the demographics form. If I edit this form, you can see that I can come in, I can add additional characters to one of the fields, and then I can click on save and return. Okay, and you can see that that change has been committed. Right, so we've created a lot of depth by adding these API buttons and also using the additional forms that we have available to us. Okay, let's get back to the presentation. Okay, if there are any questions for API buttons or anything along those lines, based on what I just showed you, please go ahead and paste those questions into our chat. Otherwise, you can save them for the live Q&A at the end. Okay, so let's talk about enhancing data with rich text. So imagine having something like this. And no, this is not a different application. This is the same application that Bob and I have been using this entire session. It's the same data. You can see that we have hire date, years of service, the username, the role, and the list goes on. Everything is the same. The difference is that we're utilizing the capabilities within Quickbase and HTML to give us this beautiful experience. So let's level up, and I'll show you a little bit more behind the scenes on how you can utilize rich text. Okay, so what I have here is, if I go into my users, I have a number of roles that we've created. So we have our formula URL role, and this is all the same for the application that is out in the Exchange. So the normal administrator is the role that Bob used to demonstrate the organization of the form. The formula URL administrator, that is the user that I was just using to show you the formula URL experience with those buttons and the multiple forms. And then we also have a rich text administrator, which is what I will change to now to show you some of the rich text that we have in this particular app. So now, as a rich text administrator, you can see that my experience is completely different, right? So this is all based on a form that is coming out of our parent resources record, right? So what we have here is a table that is a parent to resources. It's a single record table. And what it does is it actually looks for the user that is currently logged in, and then it pushes that field down as a lookup field down to resources, and then we summarize a number of these data elements to get us this particular experience. So in other words, if I wanted to test as a different user, for example, let's try Bob. Actually, you know what? Before I test a different user, let me just make Bob a rich text administrator. And now, if I test as Bob, you'll see that I will see all of Bob's data. Okay, so I'm not going to necessarily get too deep into how this is all set up, but I encourage you all to, again, download the application and start digging in to get a better understanding. But this will create a nice experience for users as they log in so they can see the data that is most important to them, right? So let's talk about what it is we're looking at here. So we have a number of wonderful things that are making our data look really beautiful and pop out and very engaging. Really helping that adoption that Bob was mentioning earlier in the presentation, right? So what is really behind all of these buttons? So to do that, let me just get us into this view, and I'll go ahead and I'll look at the properties of this tile. Now we have two separate tiles, and I know that this formula is very overwhelming compared to what we've seen so far, but as I walk you through it, it's really, really not that bad. Right? So the first thing that we're doing here is we're setting some variables to create some styling, right? So here, I have a variable that's defined as BG color. Now, this is nothing that you're tied to. You can name your variables anything that you want, something that perhaps is intuitive to you and your team. You can see here that I've defined BG color, and then I'm passing a hex value. Now, I don't necessarily need to use hex values. Quickbase will allow you to actually spell out the name of the color. So for example, if I wanted my background color for this particular tile to be red, I can just go ahead and replace that hex value to red, and the color will change wherever I have this particular variable defined. The next thing we have here is the data style. So a lot of information here, but what I like to do just to ease the nerves for folks who are seeing this for the first time, is just to compare this to Microsoft Word, for example. Here we have our font family. We're using the Avenir font. We're picking our font size at 400%. We're setting the font weight. So here we can define whether it's regular font, bold, italicized. We can also pad things, right? We can also align things. So again, it's not all that scary to think about these particular formulas. And again, the wonderful thing that we've done for you here is we've made this application available to you, so you can come back and reference all these things and perhaps incorporate them into the applications that you plan on working on, right? So if we keep looking down, here we have data and label settings. And here we're creating some variables to actually pull out data that we have available in the application. Here we're pulling out years of service. And now if we look down below, here is the actual tile code, right? So we're using some HTML to build out a table, right? And then here you'll see that we're taking those variables that we've defined and we're lending them to these particular data elements, right? So here's another variable that will get displayed on the screen, and we're using these variables to stylize the data that will be displayed. Same thing for here. We're using these particular variables to stylize the label for hire date. And the same is true for years of service, right? So now that you understand that, let's go back and let's take a look. And here we have it, right? So everything that you saw there is what makes up this one little tile, right? So let me give you another example of a tile. It's a little bit different. So you'll notice here that we have a tile that's a different color than the rest, but you'll also notice as I scroll my cursor across, you'll notice the cursor actually changes, right? So this is an actionable tile, right? And if I go ahead and I click on this, you'll notice that that report or that list of dates that I had listed here is now gone. I'll click it again, and you'll notice that it's back, right? Now, what's happening here is this is an actionable tile, which is checking a box, and then we're using dynamic form rules to display the associated field for that actually will display these values. So if I go ahead and I click on this again, you'll notice that the checkbox is no longer checked. So let's take a look under the covers and let's see how that all works. Right, so a lot of the familiar things that you saw just a moment ago in terms of styling and the variables that we have set. But really what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the button code that we have defined down here. Before I actually get to the button code, you'll see that we have a number of other variables that's creating that toggle experience, right? So this is the toggle for that checkbox. And then here is the URL that we're actually going to be executing. And we see that we have it defined in our button code. But let's talk about it. So remember, that was a 3-tile rich text field that you were looking at. So in the first position, we had our allotted days defined, right? So here's the value for allotted days. Here's the label for allotted vacation days. Again, with those variables lending themselves to the styling of those values. And then here, this is that middle tile, okay? So if the report checkbox is false, then what we will do is we will use this styling to show us the normal color of the tile for number of approved vacation dates and scheduled days. However, if the button was actually pressed, we're using this styling, right? So this is all defined up here. So we added some additional styling in our variables for pressed button and label style pressed, okay? And then here is that last tile. And in this case, this is not an actionable tile. But what makes it actionable in that middle tile is here. So we're passing this element that will actually allow us to use the URL to execute, which is defined here, okay? So if I click on my return to main, this will take me back to my screen. I'm actually going to go back and click on home. So now the next thing that I want to highlight are the buttons. So we talked about formula URL buttons. And what we're actually looking at here are rich text buttons. So if I go ahead and click back into this view, and I right click, edit the properties of the field. And here we have the formula that makes up this particular button. Okay, some of the same things that you've already seen where we have the variables that provide the styling. Here is the URL that we're actually executing, represented by this variable URL. And then here is our button code, again, using HTML along with this element to make it an actionable button. And so this is the URL that we're targeting based on the variable that we have set here. And again, it's very similar to what you saw before. Really, this is the piece that you saw when we were showing the formula URL button. The only additional element that we've added here is the IVF equals 1, which will actually hide the borders that Quickbase shows us, where we actually see the tables and things like that. Right? And then lastly, what I'll do is I'll take you over to time off, and I'll show you some things that we've done here. So if I click on search dates, what I can do here is I provided users with this dropdown where they can actually see vacation dates that they have either this week, next week, or perhaps vacation dates that they've had in history. So for example, if I click on that option and then I click on save and return, we can see that these are all the dates that they've already had vacation for, right? If I wanted to perhaps see a range of dates, these are fields that actually live on the resource table, but I then look them down into the vacation schedule table, and I use these particular dates as lookup fields in that table as fields to manipulate a report, right? So what I can do here is I can put in a range of dates. So let's pick yesterday to the 27th. And then if I click on save and return, you can see that it shows me all the vacation dates that I have within that range. Okay. Another thing that I'll show you is we'll go over and we'll request some PTO. And you'll notice that we have this rich text field. And this is a fun one where on our vacation dates table, anytime a vacation day is approved, we are then summarizing this information into the resources table and then chaining it along based on the order of the date. And we're also doing some really cool things where any dates that are in history, again, very similar to what you saw in those other rich text fields where we're using variables to stylize. We're stylizing dates that are in history to be gray. Anything that is in the future, or perhaps even today, will be orange. And then anything that's in the future, or dates that are, are waiting to be taken, will be green. Right? So a lot of fun stuff that we can do with rich text. So folks, if you want to learn more, we have a number of available resources to you. We have our online help guide, we have our care team, and of course, Quickbase University. And like we've been referencing all along, the Headcount app, which is the application that we've been using all along, a version of that application is currently available to you in the Exchange. And a number of the examples that you saw here are available to you. So we highly encourage you to go out and download that application and dig in, learn more. And we're excited to see what our users can do with the things that we're teaching them here. So that'll do it, folks. So now what we'd like to do is we would like to open this up for any live Q&A. Perhaps there are some questions that you saved for the end. Perhaps there are some questions out in our chat that, that our panel were unable to answer, and we'd be glad to answer those questions now.
Manny, did you see number 31? Anything specific they should do to view this app that's downloaded?
Let me take a look here. Is there anything specific we should do? Okay, so what you need to do, when you download the application, you should see an orange button that has the application instructions. So there is a little bit of setup that you need to do to be able to effectively use the app. So I'm hoping that perhaps that's what Gabby's run into there. Yes. Let me share my screen. So John Crossland, I will show you the save and return button in just a moment. And Bob, once again, if you could tell me if you can see my screen.
Yep, got it now.
So really all this is doing, here's the main URL. All it's doing is just redisplaying the record. And as long as you have the table settings to save whenever a change has been made, then the button should save. Well, that's for a formula URL, but really this is the magic. And I'm really glad that this question was asked. Here is one of the new classes that we introduced recently. So for rich text buttons, up until I want to say it was either April or May, we were unable to use those to actually save records. We were only able to use formula URL buttons to do that. But now with this new class, Save Before Navigating, any changes that have been made to a record will be saved after clicking the button. So this example is available into the version of the application that we have in the Exchange. While I'm at it, the other thing that I wanted to highlight was the other class that we introduced recently. And that would be the openness pop-up. So to get the full effect of that, if I come back home, what I'm referring to is the business card. You'll notice that it is an actionable button. If I go ahead and I click on that, you'll notice that this opened up a new tab. Depending on your settings, it would open up as a pop-up. But if I dig in, you'll notice that we have this new class, openness pop-up. Right, so the original question was, we wanted to see the save and return for rich text. And again, it was that class that really made the difference. Save before navigating. Do you see any other questions that haven't been answered? I don't see any.
Number 18, how well these multiple forms will work with everyone on the internet role. You've got to be very careful with that role in the first place. For one thing, you usually don't, I've never seen an instance where we could justify having a user directly edit a form or a record. We typically set it up so that they can only add records. And there again, a lot of times we'll send out an email that's got a button in it that says, hey, non-user, click this button and enter your information. Well, in that button, you could direct them to a specific form, and then you could have other buttons, as Manny's shown, in that form that direct them to other forms specific for the EOTI. But with an EOTI, you don't want them to be able to edit, again, just add. So you typically create a copy of your table that they're adding records to. If they need to make changes, they would make them in like an update table and then push those via pipelines to the main table. Hope that helps.
So there's a question here, number 37, Patrick Dunn. And there's a question around the save and return button and creating a very specific experience for that save and return, perhaps based on role, or perhaps you want to direct the user to a very specific form. Absolutely, you can do that, and that's exactly what we're doing here. So each save and return button you saw, depending on what form you were looking at, it was a very specific save and return for that particular form. And if we looked at that formula, you would notice that the DFID was set very specifically to take the user to that form to create that experience. So Patrick, I hope that answered your question.
38's a good one. Could you take these CSS styles into a separate file and use them in a formula? I think you actually did that, Manny. With the background color.
Oh, yeah. That actually, let me show the gang that. That's a good one. So one of the things that, as Bob and I were working on this, one of the considerations we had, and Bob, please let me know when you can see my screen.
Got it.
Is we understand that, some of the formulas, not only can they be really daunting, but also we understand that we want to create some flexibility in the sense that we don't want to necessarily reach out to an administrator every time we want to change something within the application. So the example that I'm using here is, let's say you do use this application, right? And let's say your company goes through a new rebranding effort and your colors have changed. Well, now you don't necessarily have to reach out to an administrator to make that change, right? So if I look into the button code here, you'll notice that before, in the examples that I demonstrated, oops, sorry about that. In the examples that I demonstrated, we had a hex value. In fact, I probably have an example of that in here somewhere. But in any case, here, for example, so here's the old value. This is the old variable that I had defined for BG color, which was that hex value. But then you'll notice here that I'm supplying an actual field, right? So what does that give me? Let me duplicate this tab. And if I go over to parent resources, because again, that's where this is all being handled, and I edit this one record, I have this field, which is called the background color selector. Right now we have it set to Quickbase Forest, but I can change it to a different color that I have available to me. In this case, let's select dark tangerine. And if I save that, and I go back to my home screen, you'll notice that this is now changed, and it's global. So just to give you another idea what I mean by that, if I go ahead and I test as Bob, Bob now has that same experience, right? So it was a very simple change by changing a value in a record within the table versus having, again, somebody with administrative privileges go in and manipulate a formula to give you the desired result. Actually, let me see if there are any other things that I wanted to show you guys here while I'm here. Bob, any other questions that we have out there?
One interesting one, is there a way to dynamically reference the FID? I don't know of a way to pull it from the URL, but if you were clicking on a button to get to a form, you could have a field on that form hidden in the admin section that when you click that button, it tells you which form ID you're going to, and you can also put that value in that hidden admin field. I think in the entrance, Patrick's talking about us to get some feedback.
That would be a very deliberate situation, so it's not necessarily dynamic, right? So we would actually have to have a value defined in a field, yeah. But that's a good question, Patrick. We can certainly take that one away and see if there's anything we can come up with on that.
I don't want to ignore any questions, but number 40, can you throw some insights into the tech stack or frameworks used by the Quickbase to build this application? I can't. Tech stack's out of my pay grade.
I mean, as far as what we used to build, I mean, this was everything that you saw in this application was native to Quickbase. There was nothing that we did outside of Quickbase. Is all native functionality within the platform.
Number 39, can you set the iframe to a specific size on a pop-up? I don't believe so yet.
Yeah, I'm not. That's something I'm familiar with.
Okay. Number 42. Yeah.
So, sorry to step on you, Bob. So when I refer to the rich text administrator or the formula URL administrator, those are roles that I specifically created for the headcount application. But that's not to say that as an administrator, you wouldn't have access to a rich text field or the capability of adding rich text. We just created that specifically to create an experience for this demonstration. So a formula URL administrator, so you have the formula URL experience, a regular administrator, so Bob can do his presentation, and then we have the rich text, so we can do the final portion of the presentation. But any of those roles are not limiting you in your ability to add rich text.
And really, the name administrator is just a label on a role. You could name that role anything, magician or what have you. And as long as you set the appropriate permissions with it, that role can do administrative functions. Any other questions?
So there's one here, number 28, from Jana Clark. Is it within the scope of this presentation to talk about constructing a copy record button? I'm not exactly sure I know exactly what you want us to do there. Bob, I mean, do you have any use cases where we could maybe do something like that, or maybe you've done something like that in the past?
I have not personally, but it sounds like it may be an API function that you could put in a copy of the record.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly have APIs available that can do something like that. So I'm sure we can construct a button that would do something like that. Yeah. So Patrick, the parent resources table. So the parent resources table basically just gives us the ability to use one centralized form that we can then display on the dashboard like I showed you at the end. So what that is doing is, again, it's a single record with a record ID of 1. It's a parent to the resources table, okay? And anytime a resource record is created, the related parent resource is automatically defined with the value of 1. So therefore, that single record in the parent resources table is always aware of all of the records that are available in the resources table. And then what we do from there, and let me share my screen just so I can better illustrate it. In that parent resources table, we have a field which is identifying the current user, right? So for example, if I come over to parent resources, here's my single record. It's the only record that we have available to us, but you can see that this user formula field has my name defined. So if I dig in, we're just using that user function to identify who the user is, right? And then what we do, if I look at table-to-table relationships, so for parent to resources, I am looking up that user formula field, right? And then a number of these summary fields that I have available to me here are all based on that condition, right? So let me find a good one for you. So here we're summarizing the hire date and the years of service rich text field from resources, and we're summarizing it into the parent resources table, and we're basing it on if the user in the resources table is equal to the user in the field parent resources user formula. So that's how Quickbase will know to summarize the appropriate user's information and display that on the screen. So no matter how many users you have logged into the application at once, whoever's logged in should see their data on this particular form. And I hope that helps, and I hope that answers your question.
Number 43 is interesting, and I know you've done this, Manny. Can we have a URL button redirect to a value based off a specific field within the form?
Absolutely. We talked about that just a moment ago in the example that Bob was illustrating. So for example, if we wanted to drive a user to a very specific form based on a record that they're on, you could define that form ID, right, in that field. And then if you remember from the examples that we showed you, if you pass the field name against the DFID function or element within the URL, then that will take you to that very specific form. And there are a number of different things that we can do in that case. a lot of those elements that you saw in that URL formula can be passed as a field value. So a number of different things that we can do in that way.
And one way to do that, I've got a customer that, to simplify it, let's say they're going out on a job and they're either going to do an install, a maintenance, or a deinstall, okay? So the form is very limited when you first go into it, and it says, what type of job are you going to do? And if you choose install, okay, so that's basically one of the few fields you've got on your form, then your button will say, you'll have a case statement that's saying, if it's install, go to DFID 10. If it's maintenance, go to DFID 11. And if it's deinstall, go to DFID 12, something like that.
The other thing that I just thought about as Bob was talking through that, in terms of the dynamic nature of using rich text. So imagine this. Imagine having a form where you have a button that's actionable, but perhaps you don't want that button to be actionable until something actually happens. Perhaps a field needs to be populated with a very specific value. What you can do with rich text is, until that field has the value that you're looking for, you can use the rich text field to display a message. Perhaps that message could say something along the lines of, hey, go populate XYZ field with this value so you can actually use the button. And then once the value actually appears in the field, that same rich text field, based on the condition that we have defined, can then become an actionable button. So there's a lot of power with rich text as far as buttons and labels and things like that. 46. Can you hide the native green save buttons so users must use the native the navigation functions? So the answer to that is, if you were here earlier on in the presentation, Bob showed us a way to hide the native save and close buttons that are at the bottom of the form, but I'm not familiar with the way to actually hide the other save and close buttons that you find towards the top of the form. Bob, I don't know if you know of a way to do that. Oh,
there is no way to do that I know of. Not in native Quickbase.
And these are questions that have been asked before, and sometimes what we do is we just simply suggest that it comes down to training. So basically train your users and create documentation and references to actually how to use the application. And in this particular case, focus on the navigation buttons that have been created versus what you have natively.
There actually is a way to do it, but unfortunately you lose all the other Quickbase header info. Do you want to show them the IFV?
Yes, I will. And I have a pretty good way to show that. So Bob, once again, please let me know when you can see my screen.
Got it.
Okay, so as I mentioned before, or at least I alluded to, this is based on a form, right? So if I go in to customize my page and I look at my widget, you'll notice that all the way at the end, we go all the way to the end, you'll notice that I have this little bit that's chained onto the end of this particular URL, and that's IFV equals 1. And what IFV equals 1 will do is it'll actually hide all of the tables that you see up here. So basically the headers and the banners that you see up top. To better illustrate that, if I click on this and then I return to main, this is a better illustration. So you can see that this is just the form without any of the Quickbase information around it. So for example, if I come here and I do an edit, so in this particular case, using IFV equals 1, you can see that none of those native save and close buttons are actually up here because we've hidden that using the value that we just showed you, right? So that's one way to do it. But in terms of just targeting that single button that you normally would see up here, we don't have a way to do that at the moment.
And this is a situation we use a lot for in EOTI, everyone on the internet role, where you want to lock it down and not have them see any of the Quickbase headers, my apps, menu choices, and so forth. What you have to do, though, when you use the IFV is you've got to fully lay out your workflow navigation. You've got to be able to go forward, go back, etc. And by the way, IFV equals The number after that is how many pixels from the left it pushes to the right. We usually use IFV equals 0 or 1, so it left aligns, but you could do IFV equals 200, and that would push your form, the data that you're displaying, out to the right by 200 pixels.
Bob, number 49, do you have any experience doing that? So embedding
Embed a form within a
forms.
form. I love customers because they come up with stuff I've never even thought of. That's a beautiful one. I haven't seen that done. I'm not sure if it's possible, but you might have challenged me to try something. But like Manny showed, you can embed forms on a dashboard, and in fact, the new dashboards.
And one thing I want to highlight there, if anybody attended the earlier UI session with Ryan Murray and some others, they talked about embedding forms into the dashboard. That's something that the product is working on, not necessarily what we've demonstrated here. So I just want to make sure that I highlighted that. This was purely just previewing the form on the parent resources table and taking that URL and using it for my web page widget on my dashboard. And actually, now that I'm thinking of it, one thing that I didn't cover is what we saw was the old dashboard or the home page. I just want to show you that you can actually do this on the new dashboard as well. Now, this is not set up in the app that is in the Exchange, but in this particular version of the Headcount app, you can see that we've created the same exact experience on the new dashboard, right? So imagine in your world, if there's a use case where it's kind of along the lines of what Ryan Murray was describing in his presentation. If you wanted to create an experience where users just needed to stay on their dashboard and perhaps work with the data that they have available to them. For example, they have this report down here and they want to perhaps see, make some quick changes. You can create an experience where they're working with data on the form and never have to leave this particular dashboard, right? So this is the new dashboard with our new buttons that we have available to us, and I can actually go back to my main dash. And this is the old style dashboard, which we now refer to as the home page.
So on the previous question, Sharon, our guest Q&A panelist, said that she has tried just last week to edit to put a form within a form in an iframe, and it did not work, caused problems. So thank you for sharing. By the way, if y'all go to quickbasejunkie.com, Sharon, our QSP, has lots of great free resources and also some paid resources. But I took the HTML course and found it very valuable. Number 50, is there a way to create a button to display a PDF document in the same page or different page? I do not know of one.
I don't know one, but my mind is racing, and I think there could be a way to do it. Unfortunately, it's nothing that I have an example of here that I can demonstrate. Just scrolling through the questions to see if we have anything that's unanswered. Oh, Bob, there was one question earlier on, and I don't know if this was just coincidence or maybe just how you had your screen zoomed in, but there's a question number 15 that says, how did you get the map image to align so nicely with the fields to the left?
Well, that's just part of using sections. I can go ahead. We have time. Got some time. I will go ahead and show that. You see my screen okay?
I'll let you know when I do. All right, we can see it.
Okay, cool. Let's see the map. How did that align so nicely to the left? There's a couple different things. And like you say, putting sections in will move things around. I've got a section heading right above the address that might have done it. And sometimes I will put a section, especially when you've got an embedded report with some things above it and below it. You'll notice some of the fields try to align to the widest field, and the field will be as long as that report is wide. So what I'll do sometimes is put a section heading above and below it. And then on address field, another thing to make it align is to click alternative label text and just have it blank. Oops. Well, now we've changed our roles. We've gone through our demo, so it's not going to cooperate.
Oh, yeah. Hey,
That's
Bob,
okay.
Can you do me a favor while you're here? Can you click on Home? And I don't know if anybody noticed, but I'm sure some did, and they're curious. And while you're here, I'm hoping you could just explain it a little bit in the time that we have. So if you scroll down, you'll notice that we have these sections that are stacked side by side. So my resources, my pending vacation requests, and you can see that they're all collapsible sessions. Traditionally, most people who are accustomed to working within Quickbase probably only think that you can have sections that are stacked on top of each other. But here we've demonstrated that you can actually put them side by side. Now I will say that there are specific use cases when you want to actually do this. Depending on how you apply it, sometimes the data may get rendered in the way that you don't expect. So please be cautious as you navigate this. But Bob, if you can go over to the parent resources table. And once you're on the parent resources, go over to settings and forms. And if you could just show us the me form. And what I want to highlight here is just the way that you can achieve that. Now, from what I understand, there are perhaps maybe another way or two to do this. But what Bob will do is, Bob, if you click on row number 13, or actually 14, one or the other, it's one of those. Yeah, so number 14. So this is the start of one section. So you can see in the text, we're using HTML to open up a table. And then, Bob, if you go to the next text value on number 17, and here we're closing the table, right? So that's how we're achieving this. Now, it's not only just using those text values, you do have to have the section heading. So for example, 14 will start the table, 15, you put in a section heading, you can label that section heading. And then number 17 is what closes the table out. And then if you look on 18, 18 is another text record or field that is actually starting the next section. And that ends on 21. Right, so again, another little fun thing that you folks can incorporate into your forms as you work through your applications.
I've been doing this 20 years, and I just learned that. That is neat, advanced HTML stuff.
So folks, we are now at the end of our session. We have about 2 minutes left. I would just like to take the moment to thank all of you for being here. I know it was a pleasure for Bob and myself to present this session to you. And as I mentioned before, the application, again, it's a scaled down version of this app, but it is available to you. And although it is scaled down, all of the buttons, all of the fields, the rich text formula fields, they're all available to you. So highly encourage you to download the application and dig in. And we'll be really excited to see you guys incorporate some of the techniques that we showed you here.
Thanks, everybody. Totally enjoyed this. Hope you did too.
Thank you very much, folks.